Jonathan Turley, law professor at George Washington University, legal scholar, Fox News contributor. I am excited to talk to you this morning to put this into real-world legal perspective. So, Jonathan, as we look into the raid on former President Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago home, the word that keep being used is unprecedented. You and I spoke about it on Tucker Carlson tonight. I've heard you talk about it on the Fox News channel. Why is this so unprecedented?
Well, it's unprecedented from a number of different perspectives, the most obvious being that no president, no former president, has ever been subject to this type of raid. That doesn't mean that a president's above the law. It's just that when questions occur, usually there are accommodations short of sending a battalion of FBI agents to the door of a former president. It's also relatively rare under the Presidential Records Act. This is not a heavily enforced law. It actually doesn't have many strong enforcement components, and it is very rarely used in a criminal case. When it has been used, even in the most egregious cases, the punishment's relatively light. And that was the case with Sandy Berger. He was given no jail time at all, allowed to plead to a simple misdemeanor. His clearance wasn't even taken away permanently. Now, that's for a man who took classified documents and stuffed them in his socks and snuck them out of a secure location, hid them at another location so they could be retrieved. You couldn't come up with a more serious violation, and yet he was given no jail time at all. So there is a number of unprecedented elements here and a lot of questions that really probably need to be answered.
So a few questions then, digging in on those levels of precedent-breaking actions taken by the FBI. On the first, that this has never happened to a former president. You said there are usually accommodations that are made, considering, I would assume, all of the imagery, even the politics into raiding a former president's residence. So what type of accommodations are we talking about? You said the conclusion isn't that a former president is above the law, but that you essentially handle the situation differently. So what would precedent be, Jonathan? How would this have been handled in the past?
Well, the Justice Department itself recognizes that these types of circumstances have to be handled with some delicacy. For example, there's a standing department policy not to engage in overt prosecutorial acts that might impact an approaching election. And that's what we have, of course, with the midterm elections. Now, that's not a hard and fast rule. There's debates about how long in advance of an election you can take those steps. Trump is not on the ballot in the midterms, but it reflects a recognition by the Justice Department that it can be viewed as political if it takes steps that are viewed as sensational before an election. But when it comes to a former president, let alone a future expected candidate for the presidency, that delicacy is really at its most acute level. You know, this is not just the past opponent of President Biden. It's expected to be the future opponent of President Biden. And that's what makes this all rather odd and frankly alarming. There's still no explanation as to why this was necessary. The Trump family has insisted that it has cooperated and that it was willing to give access to any boxes any offices requested. That's clearly not what was said in the application for this warrant. It's hard to believe the agents told the federal judge, well, we could just give a subpoena, but we'd prefer to descend upon Mar-a-Lago with dozens of federal agents.
Can I assume that the FBI's argument would be that the Trump family, that Donald Trump is dragging his feet in turning over these documents, that they've exhausted the sort of, and again, I'm trying to anticipate the argument from the FBI, that they've exhausted the cordial precedent as you laid out? I would assume that's what they would say to a federal judge or magistrate that signed off on this warrant. And then the question is that true, right? Did they use subpoena power? Did they coordinate with the Trumps? Or did they immediately run past go and send in the 30 agents to raid?
I think that is the relevant question, Will. I mean, it's hard to imagine that the Trump family was given a list of documents or concerns over existing documents and simply told them to pound sand. But presumably, the application not only said there was no expected cooperation, but that there was a danger of destruction. Now, all of that is odd because the target was not at the residence. So you actually could have used a subpoena here to achieve exactly what was achieved. But one of the questions I have is that you had 15 boxes recovered at the beginning of the year. What I'd like to know is, were there communications after that? Was there a list of documents? Usually on these applications, you do need particularity. You do need details that are then used in the descriptive portion of the warrant. You should be able to talk about those details. After all, the Trump family now knows them. They had to be given a copy or shown the warrant. So one would think they could be at least open about that.
You know, so the question we're trying to answer intellectually, you and I here together, is whether or not the actions of the FBI represent an honest pursuit of justice or whether or not they represent a partisan political power play. And the question then on whether or not they exhausted all other avenues to get the information that they're looking for helps us understand, is this par for the course or is this partisan? But the second level of precedent-breaking actions by the FBI that you point out is, even if they did exhaust every resource, and we're speculating here because we don't know the particulars of the search warrant, but even if they did exhaust every single aspect and the Trump family told them to, as you said, pound sand, how serious is the potential charge? And that takes me back to your Sandy Berger explanation or analogy. What is the potential charge? Assuming it is this National Archive issue, how serious is this, and what does history suggest the FBI would have done in the past?
Well, in the past, records violations of this kind have not been prosecuted or prosecuted lightly. James Comey, of course, was not dealing with presidential records, but he was responsible for removing FBI material and then leaking the contents to the media. He was not prosecuted or sanctioned in any way. General Petraeus was also given frankly, a sweetheart deal similar to Berger's. He was allowed to plead to a misdemeanor, no jail time, when he gave classified military information to his lover. So the history here is rather lax. Now, the provision that is most likely to be used does allow for 3 years incarceration, but it also says that this has to be done willfully and unlawfully. And the Justice Department defines willfully as something other than negligence. It doesn't have to be evil intent, but it has to be specific intent. You have to show that Donald Trump specifically intended to withhold or conceal these type of documents. And once again, it just would be baffling why anyone who doesn't have a self-destructive mania would stare down the Department of Justice and say, I'm just not going to let you see those documents. This is a hostile department. Why would he do that? But we'll find out. We don't know. But in terms of the prosecution itself, this has been an area of misdemeanor prosecutions, not felonies.
And Jonathan, and again, we're in the realm of speculation here. What is it that we're presuming is inside these documents that is so important to the FBI?
Well, that's the interesting thing about the Presidential Records Act, Will. You know, I've written a lot about the PRA as an academic, and I've testified on it a number of times, including recently with regard to Donald Trump's earlier encounter with the archives at the beginning of the year. Presidents have always chafed at this act. It is not entirely clear in some of its details, including the details as to the destruction of documents. But presidents have often resented this, and there has often been these conflicts. Presidents leave with documents. The archives, quite understandably, do what all archivists want, and that is they want to archive. And so they constantly tell these presidents, bring them back. those don't result in FBI raids. So we have to sort of figure out what went off the rails here and why this was necessary to take this step. The details that are coming out are just sort of baffling. You know, they brought in a safe cracker apparently and broke open a safe, and the Trump family says that there was nothing in the safe, sort of like Al Capone's safe. We need to know a little bit more as to what prompted this. But keep in mind, and I've been saying this over and over again, people on various networks have been celebrating this event and talking about orange jumpsuits coming out for the president. There's no reason to assume that there will be criminal charges here, even if they find classified material, because they might not have specific intent. So all of this assumption about charges are on the way are really misplaced from reality.
Well, really quickly here, let's follow that line on what the others in the media are celebrating. I think they are presuming there is some type of assumption that within these documents, it's not simply a food fight between the National Archives and a former president, but that Donald Trump, again, I'm assuming this is their presumption, but that Donald Trump is hiding something in these documents that is incriminating, most likely in their minds, about January 6th.
Well, there can be. I would assume that Trump's counsel made it clear from the outset that they wanted some type of review procedures to protect privileged and private information. But if they do run across incriminating evidence, they are allowed to obviously share that unless there's some court order restricting them. But there's a lot of fanciful talk about what could come next. Mark Elias, who was Hillary Clinton's lawyer, who has been accused of lying about or misleading media about the source of the Steele dossier, said that, that Trump could be disqualified, even if he's not subject to much of a criminal charge or jail time, it comes with disqualification. I think that's absolutely wrong. The provision does talk about disqualification, but I think the provision's unconstitutional. The Constitution has a way to impeach and disqualify a former president, but Congress can't add to those qualifications. There's a couple of cases involving limits on congressional offices that the court has struck down and said you just can't, as Congress, add things to the Constitution by statute in terms of qualifications. Well, that was for Article 1. The same is probably true about Article 2 and adding qualifications to the presidential seat.
Right. So this is where I think we'll tie our conversation together. So last night when I hosted Tucker Carlson Tonight and you appeared with us, I heard from several different voices, including Shannon Bream. It was, I believe, Shannon Bream's estimation that the FBI wouldn't take this step of executing a raid unless they felt confident that that would soon be followed by another action, i.e., an indictment. That it would simply be too much of a food on their face, I guess, if they did this raid without then being able to pursue in its wake an indictment. I heard from others, Miranda Devine, who think of this more as a fishing expedition, looking to see what they might find, as we point out, that they're hoping is incriminating about, say, January 6th. So here's my question for you. What do you think is next? What is the fallout? Meaning, will there be an indictment? Will this be yet another, 5-year drug out, quote unquote, investigation? And then thirdly, I think I've already heard your answer to this. Does it then therefore disqualify Donald Trump from running for president?
Well, I think that Shannon makes a very good point that if you're acting responsibly, you shouldn't take this step unless you know what the next step will be. You shouldn't take this step unless you're pretty certain what you're going to find. And that would certainly suggest that they do have an expected indictment, but it's just impossible to tell. None of this really makes a lot of sense because they could have gotten this information with a subpoena. But Shannon's correct that if they were being cautious as they should be, they shouldn't take this step unless they had the next step laid out. But we have to wait because we've been wrong so many times before. Remember, there have been raids and arrests with warrants that many of us questioned as to their necessity. People have been subject to raids where everything of consequence was taken. They haven't been charged. People like Victoria Tenzing, even Giuliani has had raids, and we still haven't seen the true fruits of that raid coming out in terms of charges. So we can't make any assumptions because of this history.
And to be clear, just to answer the final part of that question, then the fallout, you do not anticipate, as does Mark Elias, that this in any legal way impacts Donald Trump's ability to run for president?
I think a court would reject that argument. I think it should, even if you find a trial judge that's sympathetic. I think the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court would reject that argument. I think there's pretty strong precedent in this area.
All right, Jonathan Turley, as we go through what is precedent and what is unprecedented, it leaves, and I'll leave it up to the listener and the viewer's mind to answer the question of whether or not this is an honest pursuit of justice, or when breaking precedent on this many levels, it reveals partisan political motivations. Jonathan, thank you so much for jumping on and shedding light on this issue.
Thank you, Will.
Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain Podcast for full episodes right now.